Good afternoon. As you all know, we celebrate Independence Day this weekend. So when we think of the whole sense of freedom, we need to remember that that freedom is intended for all persons in this country. We hear a lot about Black Lives Matter these days, and we have to remember that whether we're white or African American, Hispanic, Asian, or Native American, that we all deserve that freedom and the rights of everyone in this country. So I thought that today I would start the story of Sacagawea. Some of you may have heard of her in classes. She was a Native American woman who helped in the Lewis and Clark expedition in the early years of our country. So this would be done in two parts. So today, I begin with the introduction, and then we'll read some of the story so that you have a sense of the history of our country. And so let us begin. This is the introduction. Did you ever think you couldn't do something because of who you are or where you come from? Well, my story, Sacagawea, proves that anything is possible. In the early days of the United States of America, life was hard for a lot of people. Pioneers faced harsh weather, lack of food, wild animals. But life was especially hard for me. Born an Indian girl, I didn't have many rights or much freedom. The white people trading and traveling the land were either scared of Indians or thought we were inferior. Even within my tribe, women were treated as property to be traded, just like horses. No one imagined that I was destined for more than cooking, cleaning, gathering food, raising children, and obeying my husband. Yet, while I was still a teen, I not only accompanied the explorers, Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark, on one of the most important trips ever made on this continent. I also ensured that the voyage was a success. Our 4,000-mile journey went from the center of the country to the Pacific Ocean, which was filled with all kinds of danger, that journey. We braved rough rivers, near starvation, illnesses, rugged mountains, and terrifying storms. Our goal was to map the unknown area and find a route to the sea for future generations. And I did it with a newborn baby strapped to my back. Brought along to translate for the Indians we would meet along the way, I demonstrated courage, kindness, and competence in all that I did. Whether pointing out the best way to travel over the mountains or finding routes for the men to eat, I did my best to help the group. Of course, the mission's success was not mine alone. It was due to people from different cultures and places trusting one another and working together. I did go on to become one of the most famous Indians and women in history. However, my biggest triumph was personal. Seeing the great Pacific Ocean, I knew I had achieved more than I or anyone else could ever have imagined. I am Sacagawea. This is a map of the journey that people who traveled from here to here in times that did not have airplanes and motorized cars. So these are some of the people we will meet in our story. Sacagawea. She's a teenage member of the Shoshone tribe who helped to guide and translate during Lewis and Clark's expedition to the Pacific Ocean. She became a national hero. We will meet Jumping Fish. She was Sacagawea's childhood friend, who was also kidnapped by members of the Hidatsa tribe. Jumping Fish, known for her quick moves, escaped, and she made it back to her tribe. Toussaint Charbonneau. He was a French-Canadian fur trader who was living among the Hidatsa when he married Sacagawea and used his young wife to negotiate a well-paid spot on the Lewis and Clark's expedition. We will meet Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. He was the son of Sacagawea and Charbonneau. He was not barely 2 months old when he was strapped to his mother's back to cross the continent. Meriwether Lewis, President Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary, who headed up the Corps of Discovery to find the route from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. William Clark, the military officer who was asked by his friend Lewis to be co-captain of the Corps of Discovery. He developed a special friendship with Sacagawea and eventually wanted to adopt Jean-Baptiste. Kamai Wyatt, Sacagawea's brother and chief of her Shoshone tribe. He traded the horses that allowed the Corps of Discovery to make it over the Rockies and on to their final destination. Sacagawea was born 1788 or 1709 to the Shoshone tribe in the present-day area of the Salmon River in Idaho. She was kidnapped in 1800 by members of the Hidatsa tribe. 1803, President Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase from France, and he asked Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark to explore the large, unknown territory and find a trail to the Pacific Ocean. They called the expedition the Corps of Discovery. In November of 1804, Lewis and Clark arrived near the villages of Mandan, where Sacagawea is living with her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau. The explorers agree that the Indian teenager will accompany them on their journey to translate and negotiate with other Indians they meet on the voyage. In February 11, 1805, Sacagawea gave birth to her baby boy, whom she named Jean-Baptiste. April of 1805, the Corps of Discovery leaves Fort Mandan, Sacagawea, with her 2-month-old infant strapped to her back. In June of 1805, Sacagawea dies of fever, but Clark nurses her back. She nearly dies, of a fever, but Clark nurses her back to health. At the end of June 1805, she almost drowns, along with Clark, Charbonneau, and baby Jean-Baptiste, in a flash flood near the Great Falls. In August, When the Corps of Discovery arrives in Shoshone territory, Sacagawea is reunited with her tribe and with her brother Kamehameha, who is now the chief. At the end of August 1805, after Sacagawea helps the Corps of Discovery trade with the Shoshone for horses, she says goodbye to her tribe as the explorers head into the Rocky Mountains. January of 1806, Sacagawea makes it to the Pacific Ocean. And in March 1806, the Corps of Discovery turns around to head home. In December of 1812, Sacagawea dies of a fever at Fort Manuel in present-day South Dakota, according to the diary of John Ludig, a clerk. In April 9, 1884, an Indian woman who's about 94 years old dies. Indians and missionaries living on the reservation are sure she is Sacagawea. Chapter 1. A Childhood in the Wind, in the Wild. This is a picture of the native peoples look like in their teepees and all their fires. The native people who lived in North America long before the United States existed had a diverse group of cultures, despite the fact that the white settlers who arrived called all of them Indians. Did you know why they were called Indians? The name actually comes from the explorer Christopher Columbus, who thought he had landed in the Indies when he arrived in America, and called its inhabitants Indians. Just like people from different countries, members of different Indian tribes spoke completely different languages and had different customs, even when they lived right near one another. Some tribes were wealthier, others poorer. Some farmed the land, while others existed by fishing, hunting, and gathering. When members of two tribes who didn't speak the same language wanted to communicate, they used sign language or pictures drawn on the ground with a stick. Often, when different tribes came in contact with one another, it was in battle. Indians fought regularly, attacking villages or camps in search of guns, horses, food, and people. Whoever proved to be the fiercest warriors took women and children as prisoners back to their own camp. The Shoshone, the large tribe into which Sacagawea was born in 1788 or 89, had groups called bands all over present-day Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, and Nevada. Shoshone means snake, and was a name that other Indians called the tribe because they associated them with the Snake River. But the tribe called themselves Nirimuna, or people. Sacagawea's band, called the Lenhi Shoshone, lived so deep in the wilderness they didn't have any contact with white people until Lewis and Clark arrived. During the long, bitterly cold winters, they stayed in their village located in the Rocky Mountains. Wrapped in rabbit skins to keep warm, the men hunted for deer or mountain sheep. They were also known for raising powerful horses that could travel over the rocky terrain. Women worked just as hard, caring for children, drying meat, preparing furs and skins, cooking meals, and searching for berries and edible plants. Whether meat or roots, food was often scarce. Spending most of the year in the harsh Rocky Mountains wasn't exactly their choice. The Lemhi often warred with the Hidatsa tribe that had control of the land near the intersection of the Missouri and Knife Rivers, which was fertile from all the water rushing through it. The Hidatsa, who grew corn, squash, and tobacco, traded crops with other Indians for horses, hides, and blankets. Then they would trade those goods with the white men coming down the rivers in exchange for guns and ammunition. The guns made the Hidatsa practically invincible. The Lemhi, who only had bows and arrows to protect themselves, were forced to retreat into the cold mountains. In the summer, however, Sacagawea's band would have to come down from the mountains in search of buffalo. They used every part of the animal, the meat for food, the skins for clothing, the bones for needles and dishes, the tendons for teepees, and the sinew for thread. The threat of the Hidatsa was always there, but finding a buffalo was essential to their survival. The summer Sacagawea was about 12 years old. Her band was on the way to their regular summer camp in Three Forks, Montana, named for the three rivers that meet at one point. The area was perfect for hunting, with cool mountain breezes coming off the Rockies and plenty of wildlife. The abundance of water meant lots of berries and plants for the women to gather. It was a day like any other. Sacagawea left her parents, brother, and sister to join her friend, Jumping Fish, who got her name because she was always darting around quickly like a fish in water. As she plucked the berries growing alongside a sparkling stream, perhaps Sacagawea was daydreaming about her future. As a young girl, her father had promised her as a wife to a much older man. Women and girls in her tribe were considered the property of their fathers and husbands. Soon enough, she would have to go live with the man, and everything about her life would change. Whether or not Sacagawea was daydreaming, she didn't hear the Hidatsa warriors creeping up behind her on horseback. The women and children, busy with their tasks, had no clue they were silently surrounded. That is, until Lemhi men spotted their enemies and tried to attack. The awful sounds of men and horses fighting filled what had been a peaceful scene only seconds before. The Shoshone launched arrows at the Hidatsa on their thrashing horses, but the Hidatsa returned with gunfire that brought down the Shoshone men. The loud crack of the guns and the swift destruction terrified the Shoshone men, who turned their horses around and galloped away. A few women and children ran after the men from their tribe, but they couldn't keep up with the horses. Their eyes stung from the dust cloud left by the retreating Shoshone. Within seconds, the Hidatsa were upon them. Meanwhile, Sacagawea rushed into the river. She scrambled through the icy, rushing waters, aiming for one of the small islands where she could hide in the tall grass. Then one of the Hidatsa men grabbed her and lifted her onto his horse. Sacagawea had been captured. The warrior held her tightly in his arms while he rode back to his village. As she left behind everything and everyone she knew, Sacagawea may have wondered what was going to happen. Chapter 2. New worlds to explore. In some ways, life in the Hidatsa village wasn't all that different from life in Sacagawea's home. She had to work very hard preparing hides, drying meat, sewing, and doing everything else Indian women were expected to do. However, that's where the comparisons ended. In the cluster of villages on the Missouri River, near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota, over 6,000 Hidatsa and Mandan lived together. Unlike her tribe, which used teepees for shelter as they moved around in search for food, the Hidatsa farmed the land and lived in solid earthen huts. They also spoke a completely different language. When she first arrived, Sacagawea had no one to talk to, since her friend Jumping Fish, who had also been captured, managed to escape and find her way back to the Limhi. The young Indian girl must have been very lonely. Sacagawea learned to speak the Hidatsa language, and after 3 years with the tribe, was considered old enough to be married. She had no choice in the matter. Sacagawea was sold to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader who was known to have a bad temper. At least 20 years older than Sacagawea, Charbonneau had been living among the Hidatsa and Mandan for some time before they were married. Charbonneau became friendly with his Indian neighbors. He learned to speak their language and adopted many of their customs. One of the customs he adopted was the common practice for men to have more than one wife. When Charbonneau married Sacagawea, he already had another wife named Otter Woman. While Sacagawea was adapting to a whole new way of life, thousands of miles away, the President of the United States in Washington, D.C., bought land from France that doubled the size of the country. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson paid the French government about $15 million for the Louisiana Purchase. That bought 828,000 square miles of land, which included the present-day states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri, as well as parts of 7 more states. At the time, however, the region was almost completely unexplored and unknown. Jefferson, the 3rd President of the United States, needed someone to travel this mysterious land and bring back information. He wanted to know all about the geography, the plants, the animals, and the people of the area. But even more important, he wanted to find a trail from St. Louis, Missouri to the Pacific Ocean. At that time, St. Louis was the last point of civilization before the wild western frontier began. Jefferson hoped the Missouri River, just a few miles north, would be the start of a new trade route. He asked his 29-year-old personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to organize an expedition to investigate the new land. It became known as the Corps of Discovery. president told Lewis, "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it, to find out what may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce." That was a straightforward request. The journey, however, would be anything but straightforward. Lewis had no idea what he would find when he stepped into the wilderness. He needed help to lead this trip. So he called on his good friend, William Clark, a 33-year-old military officer. Both had been in the Army and had a lot of experience living out in the wild. They could hunt and fish, make shelters, and defend themselves against enemies. This is Lewis and Clark. After finding about 40 soldiers, hunters, and boatmen to join their adventure, including Clark's slave York, the Corps set off for St. Louis, where they spent the winter of 1803. Lewis insisted on bringing along his dog Seaman, a Newfoundland, who could swim better than most men, most of whom couldn't swim at all. There, they waited out the harsh winter weather. Then in May 1804, after the ice had thawed, they set off on the Missouri River, not sure who or what they would find. Chapter 3. The newest and littlest member of the Corps. This is how they traveled in those days. When the Corps of Discovery arrived at the Hidatsa and Mandan villages in the fall of 1804, it was big news. Unlike Sacagawea's band of the Limai, who had never seen white people before, these tribes were used to foreigners coming through the area to trade. Still, word spread quickly from hut to hut about the men in the boats. They didn't have a lot of entertainment, and this definitely counted as such. The weather had already turned, so Lewis and Clark set up camp for the winter across the river from the villages. They couldn't travel during the coldest months. The temperature could drop to 50 degrees below freezing, and it was as good a place as any to wait for spring. The Indians they met seemed friendly, but Lewis and Clark wanted them to stay that way. So they invited the Indian chiefs over many times to give them gifts, such as shiny medals bearing the image of Thomas Jefferson. They also explained that the Corps came in peace. The Indians approved and returned with gifts of corn and other crops they had grown, as well as buffalo meat. Everyone was happy with the exchange. With winter approaching, the Corps got busy building a shelter. Fort Mandan consisted of 8 cabins made from cottonwood trees, the cracks stuffed with rags and grass for insulation. They also built a high stockade with a gate and lock, just in case the Indians decided to stop being friendly. Charbonneau, like any smart trader, was always trying to figure out if he possessed anything with which he could make a profit. Opportunities at the Corps of Discovery didn't pass through the villages every day. Everyone knew that the travelers were headed to the sea, and to reach the sea, they would have to pass over the Rockies. They would never make it through the mountains without horses. However, they couldn't get horses from the Hidatsa and Mandan villages because they still needed to travel a good distance by water before arriving at the mountain range. That meant the Corps would have to trade for horses with the Shoshone, when they got to the Rockies. A light went off in Charbonneau's head. He was in the ideal position for a trader because he had something the Corps needed desperately: Sacagawea. As a member of the Shoshone tribe, she would easily be able to negotiate for horses. Plus, she spoke both Shoshone and Hidatsa fluently, so she could act as a translator. Charbonneau headed over to Fort Mandan to make a deal. The fur trader was right. Lewis and Clark wanted Sacagawea to join the expedition. She would translate Shoshone into Hidatsa for Charbonneau, who would translate it into French for Corps member François Labiche, who would then translate it into English. One conversation could take forever, but at least the captains would be able to understand the Indians. They offered Charbonneau $25 a month, 3 to 5 times what the other members of the Corps were making. Lewis and Clark were very glad to have Sacagawea on board, although they weren't quite as excited as Charbonneau. Lewis wrote he was useful as an interpreter only. A week after the men sealed the deal with a handshake, Sacagawea arrived at Fort Mandan with Charbonneau. They planned to live with the rest of the Corps until it was time to continue the expedition. Lewis and Clark met the teenage Indian, who presented them with a beautiful, hand-sewn buffalo robe. After she gave them the heavy garment, they learned something they hadn't known about Sacagawea before. She was 7 months pregnant. Lewis and Clark would share many adventures with Sacagawea, but the first one was when she gave birth. She went into labor on February 11, 1805 in Fort Mandan, which was filled with men who didn't have a clue about how to deliver a baby. Neither did Sacagawea, since this was her first child. Lewis, who attended to her, wrote in his journal that her labor was tedious and the pain violent. While Sacagawea struggled with contractions, someone at the fort told Lewis to give her the rattle of a rattlesnake to eat. In an extraordinary stroke of luck, Lewis had some rattles in the samples of plant and animal life he had been collecting to bring back to the president. 10 minutes after eating the rattle, Sacagawea gave birth to a baby boy named Jean-Baptiste. He became the littlest member of the Corps. And so next time we meet, we'll begin the journey across the Rocky Mountains and to the Pacific Ocean. One thing I just wanted to share with you as I go back here is what Sacagawea means. Like most Indian tribes, the Lemhi Shoshone had an oral history culture. That meant that history, including Sacagawea's name, was passed down by people saying it out loud rather than writing it down. When people did eventually write her name down in stories, they spelled it in many different ways. Lewis and Clark, who were very bad spellers, had 14 different spellings of her name in the same journals. Depending on how it is pronounced, her name means boat pusher or bird woman. Many scholars think that bird woman makes more sense. Why would people who live in the mountains name a baby boat pusher? The other one thing I wanted to share was the Northwest Passage, which is where they're going to be traveling, and then we'll end our session today. During their expedition, Jefferson hoped that Lewis and Clark would find the Northwest Passage. This was a waterway that, legend had it, traveled from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. No one knew if it really existed, but if it did, trading would be much easier. Goods could travel by boat instead of wagons, trudging over mountains and through plains. The Northwest Passage would be discovered, but not until 100 years later. The Norwegian explorer Ronald Amundsen found a direct passage from one side of the continent to the other during a sailing expedition in 1903. Unfortunately, the route, which is 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle, took 3 years to travel because of giant icebergs and treacherous seas. And so next week, when we have our reading time, our storytelling, we'll do the story of the journey of Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, and all those who traveled with them, including the little Jean-Baptiste, who was only a couple months old. And so I remind you again, this is the weekend celebrating Independence Day. Independence for all people. And we need to remember that. We are all human beings. We all have rights, and we are all to be respected and loved for who and what we are. So have a wonderful weekend. Hopefully the weather will be accommodating to picnics and cookouts, but don't forget, masks and social distancing. Have a good weekend.